Welcome to That's a Hard No, the podcast about learning to say no and set boundaries to live our best lives. I'm your host, Heather Drago. You may think, because of this podcast, that I'm a boundary setting expert, but I'm not. I'm an expert at struggling to set boundaries. But you know what? I'm working on it, and it is getting easier. Follow along with me as I learn from fellow strugglers and experts so that you too can start saying no without feeling fear, guilt, or FOMO.
You don't know where to go. Unfriendly applications got you feeling low. You're not sure what to do. Weight of expectations is coming down on you. There's a phrase you should know. Tastes so much sweeter than hello. That's a hard no.
How do we become more self-aware? Today, Dr. Cassandra LeClair, a clinical associate professor at Texas A&M University, published author, TEDx speaker, and corporate communication coach, joins us to discuss how to decipher our emotional history, unravel relational patterns, and communicate authentically. I'd love to start with supporting our listeners on some soul searching, Cassandra. So hello.
Hello.
And where should our listeners start when they want to begin to have better self-awareness?
The very first thing I think, I don't believe that people don't want to look at themselves. I think that that's a common misperception. I think what it is that we look at ourselves and then oftentimes we have shame. So then that doesn't encourage us to keep looking at ourselves. So I think the very first step is allow yourself to look inward, but try to let go of some of the shame, whether it's associated with experiences that you've had or behaviors that you've done or words that you've said, and just try to allow yourself to recognize that part of this piece of self-awareness in this journey is looking at all those pieces through a lens of these events have all made me who I am, and I have the opportunity to learn from them and grow instead of sitting in the space I maybe felt at those moments or, hanging on to kind of some of the negative things that we tend to do afterward.
Yeah. So what you're saying is people find it very hard to look inward and look at themselves because they can't separate the emotions from the history.
A lot of times, or oftentimes it hurts, right?
Yeah.
So often the things that we have to, or that we feel that we personally want to move forward from or have deeper self-awareness on, a lot of times it's associated with maybe negative behaviors that we've had or negative experiences in our past or things that people have said to us. So when we're reflecting back, a lot of times that's painful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of why some people will shut it down more easily than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will be able to look at that and say, okay, I know that that was a painful experience, but I'm going to figure out different ways to work through that. And of course it depends on how much support they have and how much they feel supported in that process. But then also it really does, this is where also it takes people different ways to come about healing, or it takes people different types of experiences or events to maybe come to this place where they want to have self-awareness. Because again, the awareness piece honestly can feel terrible sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Because you can have awareness of all of these things, some of them good, some of them bad, or your patterns or what have you. But it's really, how do we move from that awareness into the feeling of acceptance and into the feeling of action, so we truly can look at our future in a different way and experience our present in a different way.
I know that, I've done a lot of inner work. I have told our listeners before, I went through 9 years of therapy and I go back for touch-ups, I call them.
Same.
And, I had some traumas as a child, and then because of those I had PTSD, and then I had some just unhealthy self-sabotaging habits. Mm-hmm. And as I've gotten older, I don't know how or where, but I guess I just learn to forgive that person, that younger version of myself, and just say, you didn't know any better at the time, and you made that mistake, and so now, okay, what did you learn from it? How can you improve upon that? Or there are things to this day that I always hear people say, I have no regrets. No, I think anyone who says I have no regrets, they're not that they're lying. I think people regret things that they do when they hurt people or whatever. And those are those things that haunt me. Like the one time I broke someone's confidence, I divulged something I shouldn't have, or I let someone down in some way or something. Those are the things that still bother me, but I have learned to forgive that younger version of myself and say, well, you didn't know any better, but you've since, made a point of always being, trustworthy with someone else's secrets, So, I don't know. I don't know where that goes in this conversation, but I think we have to forgive ourselves sometimes.
Absolutely. That's such a big part of it. And that was honestly when I was doing, it's interesting because I've taught this and I have all this education experience, but I always felt like I was much better at teaching it than I was at doing it for myself. I really struggled with a lot of my own coping mechanisms, especially those that I, hung on to from childhood trauma, much like you're saying. And the forgiveness of myself was honestly one of the hardest pieces for me, right? I think especially when you've had an event or series of events in your life where maybe you felt like you couldn't control it or you felt like you were powerless against it, then a lot of times we do kind of develop these tendencies where if I just take ownership of everything, then I'm in control of it or I can fix it, right? And so a lot of my behaviors in relationships or in my personal life were like, oh, okay, I must have done that wrong, or shaming myself or really ruminating on how I would be better in the future or how I should have fixed something, right? And I think too, like, that's where, when you're looking at your experiences, exactly like you said, allowing yourself to recognize, okay, yep, I haven't liked how I've necessarily shown up across every situation in my life, but here's what I do like. I like the way I can look at those things and learn to grow from them. I like the ways that I can understand that I don't have to be okay with everything either. Time doesn't heal all wounds. There are things that are always going to be painful to people or frustrating to people. No matter how much inner work that you do, you might still have a nervous system reaction,
Right.
So really, like you're saying, exactly, like allowing yourself permission to forgive that person who was doing the best that they could with the resources they had at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've learned to apply that to others who've hurt me. So, my mother was a single mother who didn't have a great upbringing. And so like she did the best she could with what she had. And I've had to just like let a whole lot of stuff go because I love her. She did the best she could and she's tried to evolve as a person. And I just can't, I don't have the energy to harbor that anger or resentment or anything. I just, honestly, it's too exhausting.
I agree. And I think that's one of my favorite things about doing this kind of work, or having that awareness of your own patterns and really learning about, not just your own patterns, but okay, what are some of these other communication practices? What are some of the things that other people do? Not so you can analyze people or, go tell them who they are, but more a matter of, I think that once we have kind of an awareness of that and how it feels like us to show up, and start to contextualize that differently. Oh, okay, this is just what this looks like for that person over here. So it doesn't have to be about me, or I don't have to take their actions as personally, right? And then we still, of course, get to decide, if somebody's being a jerk to us over and over and over, we don't have to keep saying like, oh, it's because of their past, or it's because they're not looking at things. We still get to have boundaries and choose what behaviors we allow into our life. But it's that, I think that it softens people a little bit in the sense where instead of maybe my defenses being at the attack or the ready to just assume something about you or to make a judgment about you, it's a softer, more curious approach, right? Like, oh, okay, they probably do that because that's their style or their past or their whatever it is, right? And honestly, I personally believe if we all did that, the world would just be a lot nicer place too, right?
Yeah. Recently, in lots of conversations we've been having, the concept of something being morally neutral, not good, not bad. It's just a thing and it's data and you can use that data to learn from or whatever. I find like that has been really helpful to me, and it lessens that defensive response in me where I'm just like, they're not bad. I'm not good. It's just, this is what's happening in the moment.
Yeah. Keep it. And also trying to focus too, like, on the situation, right? What is the situation? What is the behavior? What is the thing, as opposed to like it being about the other person?
Right.
And that's so important, even, if we're in conflict with somebody, or if we're, if we feel ourselves being judgmental, And it's hard because a lot of times it goes against those natural defenses, like you're saying, just those innate things that we have. So really, that's where the self-awareness piece, it's not only for, how you're showing up in your behaviors, but recognizing then how you perceive the behaviors of other people too.
Right. So, on the practical side of things, are there any specific kinds of exercises or practices that people can use to kind of start looking at themselves, doing more of that inner self work?
I'm a big fan of journaling, but I'd like to put a caveat on that and tell you how I think journaling can be really important.
Okay.
So I think a lot of times people, myself included, be like, oh, I don't have time to journal, or I don't have my journal with me, or, we make up all these excuses. So the way I journal is I always have my phone with me. So sometimes it's an audio note. Sometimes it's on the notes app where I'm just speaking into the microphone and letting it transcribe it and hoping that I enunciated clearly enough to make sense of what I'm saying. And other times it will be I'll actually type in there. But the reason I like this speaking to the notes is because a lot of times my brain is processing faster than I can type or write. So it helps me to make sure I'm just getting out different things. So the thing about journaling that I find is so helpful, it goes along with exactly what you were saying about looking at things more as data, right? We're so aware of how we feel in a moment, but then we tend to forget about it. So if you can even take a span of a week, right? And say just any time you have something, maybe it's frustrating or upsetting, or a time where you feel, you're in a shame spiral for your own actions, or, you're frustrated with another person, can you just jot that in your phone? And I'm not even asking you to analyze it or go deep with it. Just take a note of it, right? Because what can be interesting over time, again, then if we're using that as a data set, looking at, oh, okay, yeah, I am always frustrated with this person. Or for some people, they'll start to recognize, oh, whenever this topic comes up, it produces a lot of anxiety in me. Or around this time of day, this is when it's harder for me to have conversations because I recognize X, Y, or Z. So I think those are really good tools because it can help you kind of, again, start to see what are some of your patterns. Because a lot of times we know, again, we're frustrated in the moment, or we think we're frustrated, about a certain person. But if we can dig a little bit deeper and be like, okay, maybe I'm not mad at that person. It's just that every time I see them, I'm overwhelmed from 9 other things. So I don't want to talk to them at that moment, or, a variety of different things. So I really like that. And I like it also because it's free. So many different things that we stack up and stack up and stack up, then all of a sudden it starts to feel overwhelming. So, making things accessible is really important to me too.
So I'm hearing you say you just do it a little bit throughout the day. You don't sit down at 8 a.m. I'm going to sit down and journal, or before I go to bed. It's not like a chore. It's just
right. If
part
I
of
feel
your
like
daily
doing
flow.
it, then awesome. If I feel like recapping something or writing more about my day, awesome. But then for me, and it's difficult sometimes when I set these goals for myself, like I'm going to journal every day, or I'm going to do this at this time, because inevitably what happens is life gets in the way, right?
Sure,
and then a lot of times too, people will beat themselves up, or then they'll just drop off completely. So you have to look at how you're going to make something a habit. And for me, it's so much easier to kind of just notate things, or a lot of times when I'm driving, I'll have processing things. So then that's where the audio note works really good as well, because I can do it hands-free, just tell my phone to do it for me. And then also it allows you the freedom and flexibility to do it in a way that feels good to you, right? So sometimes people like to type it all out and to feel like they're just getting it out. So even, if that's something where you want to pretend you're writing a letter, or you pretend you're writing a text, like I have some clients who will pretend they're writing a song and they'll writ angry lyrics,
Nice.
Whatever that looks like for you,
Yeah.
that's what's more important to me than trying to tell people this is how you narratively reframe. We can go through that stuff. But inevitably, if it's not accessible to you, you're not going to keep doing it and find any benefit from it either.
Right. I have an Apple Watch. I have the old one, so don't get too impressed. But I have the voice, you can customize your watch face, and I have the voice notes app right on here, because I always find when I'm driving, it's when I have those thoughts, and I bink, and I just do the recording, and it's been really helpful. Yeah. Anyway, it's my little
No, I
techie
think
nerd thing.
that's a great example because I think again, we have so many different tools at our disposal
Right.
that finding the way that it works for you the most, so maybe for you you're like, "Oh, I already have these other apps." You know what? Awesome. I bet several of them have different features in them that you can utilize to do this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, just backtracking a little bit, this whole podcast came about because of this year of no thing that I started. And it was me learning how to say no to one thing every day. And it was really difficult for me. So I was allowing myself for it to be really small things, like
Yes.
don't answer an email or don't answer a phone call, or it's just tiny little things, right? And the point was you had to write it down every day. And I wrote down what happened, what I said no to, and how I felt. And honestly, I felt like crap until like
Yes.
May of that year. And I was nauseous and sweaty and fearful of confrontation and all the things, and didn't do it consistently or well, hurt a lot of people's feelings, was not good at communicating. And like around May of that year, I like started to feel like, okay, I'm getting used to this now. But it still continues. And I think that collecting that data really does help you see the pattern.
Absolutely. And then you can always look back to, like, sometimes we have a tendency to focus on the things that we have yet to achieve instead of also looking at the ways that we've improved. So I'm sure just like when you're looking back on that, you can see the different ways. And you hit on something that's so important. A lot of times when we're working on boundaries, it doesn't feel good at first, because we're so used to the reasons why we don't have them in the first place, right? Because we do want acceptance, or we don't want to cause a rift, or so it causes all sorts of uncomfortable feelings like in our bodies.
Oh,
so
yes.
that can be the reason why we back off of things, right? And that's where also, like you saying you just did smaller things, right? That's also so important. We should never go out and try to, when we're first starting this, go out and set the biggest boundary ever, because then we're not going to be able to stand by it, and then we're just going to feel bad and feel like we can't do it. So really training your brain, let's use this neuroscience. Let's understand how we can make some new patterns, and giving your brain those kind of easy wins, and then reminding yourself by going back and reflecting like, oh, okay, look at how I used to do it, and look at how much I'm changed now, even if you're not like exactly where you want to be on it, right? And then also recognizing that, like you said, here you are after all this time. It doesn't mean every time you do it now it's easy. Of course not. There's still going to be times where we can have all the knowledge and understanding in the world, but when different people are standing in front of us, or we're having a different conversation, it still might not always feel as like we want it to. Also recognizing, I think, like, some flexibility in all of this as well, because it is such a process. It's not oh, I learned how to do boundaries and now I'm good. Like you said, you got to have those checkups.
Yeah. And it's still, in some areas of my life, I'm very comfortable with boundaries, and in others, I'm less comfortable, especially when it comes to family, and there's different dynamics with different
Absolutely.
pieces and parts of your family, and different expectations. To this day, I still struggle. So
Absolutely.
It's a practice. It's a study, I would say. So when you're doing this inner work, right, whether it has to do with boundaries or self-forgiveness or just breaking patterns, relational patterns or whatever, you're dealing with a lot of emotions if you're doing this inner work. But you're also dealing with other people and and the patterns they already have set with you, right? And the things they're used to you doing and the way they're used to you reacting. Like, how do you communicate, I'm changing, I'm working on this, I'm evolving, I'm not going to do this thing anymore, or I'm not going to have this kind of interaction with you anymore? Like, let's talk about that. That's hard.
Yeah,
that's
hard,
so
'cause
hard. A lot of times people don't want you to change. They're comfortable with the way things are.
Absolutely. They're comfortable, or they've benefited from you being the way that you are, or that's just how they know you. And a lot of times too, when you're changing, if somebody else, it makes them uncomfortable, because then it can also make them feel like they should be changing and they have their own resistance, right?
Right.
So there's so much wrapped up in that. And especially depending on your relational history, like you're saying, family members, friends that you've known a long time. And this is where a lot of times too, people can feel like they need to blow up their whole life and start over with relationships because it feels easier in some way, right? If you have somebody who gets to know you as you are now versus somebody who doesn't accept
Right.
who you are now. Right. So one of the things, exactly what you're saying too, is, okay, how do we talk about this? How do we let individuals know? Well, some of it is, reminding yourself why it's important to you, because otherwise you're not going to keep following through on it. So that's why I also like the idea of having the journal or having something where you can always go back to your why. Okay, what happens to me if I don't do these things? What happens to me? Again, no, we're not focusing on the other person right now. We're focusing on ourselves. What kind of energy do I expend thinking about this situation if I fall into these patterns that I no longer want for myself? And really, a lot of times we think boundaries are something we're doing to other people instead of looking at them as something that we're doing for ourselves, right? So
Yes.
really, like, you have to really work on that. And that's where that self-awareness and that self-love and all of those things really come in, because you have to choose yourself. And so often we are used to choosing other people. So it's really asking yourself too, like, why am I so willing to privilege other people's feelings over my own? And that's hard, because so much of that
There's a
can
lot of
be deeply
history.
embedded.
Yeah,
Deeply
yeah,
embedded,
yeah.
right? Especially a lot of us since childhood, it was modeled to us, or that's how we were raised. And so again, that's where your body won't feel necessarily, in alignment, or all these things we hear. When the first time you set a boundary or say no or go to have these conversations, you will not feel comfortable, most
Right.
likely, right? So also reminding yourself of, okay, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means that your body is experiencing something new and it's having a reaction or a response to it. So we have to move through that. So like, the more you can tell yourself those things and really equip your brain with, like, okay, yeah, this is how this situation, I can expect that it might be hard. I can expect my heart rate might go up. Then when you get into that space where you're getting ready to tell somebody something, you'll still feel those things, but they won't be as overwhelming, because your brain will be like, oh yeah, okay, we knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then it's also really, especially if you're trying to tell somebody a behavior you want them to change or that you don't want anymore, framing it, making sure you're using the I statements can really help. I feel this way. Solely because a lot of times when we start with when you do this, people just instantly get defensive, right?
Yeah,
And it creeps
absolutely.
up. So if we can just change some of our vocabulary a little bit, I'm not saying it's a magical solution, but it does go a long way, right? So saying, like, I feel this when you do this, like, or when this happens, like, so then also describing the behavior, and here is what would help me, really stating it especially if it's someone you have a long-term close relationship with, can you have that conversation with them where you kind of explain the importance of it? And I'm not saying you owe everybody an explanation for your boundaries. Okay, that's something completely different. But if this is something where you're like, okay, I really value this person, I value my relationship with them, but there's just a couple things that I need to work on shifting. So how can I tell them, hey, or if they've done something well, same thing, like, I don't like it when this happens when we're fighting, but when you support me in this way, it really makes me feel better. So thank you. So then we're not also just dumping on people, telling them all the things we don't like, but we're offering suggestions about, this is what would help me more, or this is what would make me feel better.
Right.
And then I think that, especially when we're like first starting this boundary work, it's so hard because a lot of times we don't know our boundaries until they're crossed. And so then
Yes.
it's like the go-to is to go tell somebody what they did wrong. And that's great. But then again, okay, but what would I have liked? Really
Right.
kind of ask yourself some of those questions too.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've said over and over on this podcast is, I think we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, life is not comfortable. And when you're changing and growing, it's like exercise. When you're working those muscles, they hurt at first.
Absolutely.
And you feel gross and sweaty, and
Yeah.
and sometimes you feel that way when you're saying no. So on that happy note, we'll be right back. That's a Hard No is brought to you by Clever Girl Marketing, my full-service agency specializing in smart, strategic marketing solutions for businesses and nonprofits. Okay, so you're probably wondering, Heather, what's with the podcast about boundaries? Why not marketing? Well, maybe in the future, but for now, it actually does relate, so bear with me here. Smart marketing, strategic marketing, requires knowing what to say no to and why. Businesses and nonprofits get inundated with marketing options and offers every day. We help you cut through all that noise, focus on your specific needs, and develop actionable strategies that are doable and actually make sense. Whether it's websites, SEO, email, social, or traditional channels, we're experienced in all of it. So if you need help figuring out your marketing, visit our website, clevergrowmarketing.com and get in touch. So speaking of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, I recently had this sort of silly conversation with my husband. He was a little annoyed because he had been texting me, and he's the kind of person that will text you, and then if you don't answer, he'll walk across the house and say, "Did you get my text?" Or he'll call, "Did you get my text?" I'll be like, maybe I can't look at it right now. So we were having this funny conversation, and he said, your phone is always on do not disturb. It's always silenced. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, it is a lot of the time. And here's why. And I just said, listen, I have ADHD. Mm-hmm. I become very overstimulated and overwhelmed. I have a lot going on with work. And when I'm in a meeting or when I'm focusing, my brain disengages and I have a hard time focusing again if I'm interrupted. So I just block out as many interruptions as I can. And then when I have time, I make a point to look and catch up on all the texts. I can't always be part of the family chat, as it's happening live. I'm going to have to chime in later. And he kind of winked at me and smiled. He's like, yeah, but you'll make an exception for me, right? And I just went, maybe sometimes. I mean, honestly, it really is. It's about my difficulty focusing and my need to think. And I'm not just like a monkey, banging on a keyboard. I'm thinking and working and writing, and it takes concentration. And so, it ended up being kind of a friendly banter thing. But I wasn't like, you're bothering me. You're always texting me. You're nagging me. It was just like, I'm really and I literally said, I'm really struggling with focus, and I'm having to kind of cut things out and block time. And, I go work at the library where my family isn't around because I just want to be able to focus. And so I think he's getting it. It took it from a tense, complaining situation to a like, oh, okay, I understand. And so I'm noticing he's less walking up the stairs and just barging into my office when he has a thought, because we both work at home. Okay. There's less of that going on. I think he got the message because I was able to kind of do it in a neutral way that wasn't complaining.
Yeah, and that's so important too, because you also expressed the why behind that, right? In terms of, this is what this looks like for me. I think sometimes we forget that having needs doesn't make us needy. It makes us human, first of all, but then also other people have different needs than us. Right. And a lot of times we think, especially if it's people that we love or we care about, or we've known a long time, we kind of assume that they're similar to us, or we get along in so many ways.
Or they would just know that.
Right, that we just know them, and really being able to tell somebody like, hey, this isn't just a like, oh, I don't want to talk to you. This is something, and I completely understand with what you're saying, because my executive functioning, my ADHD, that's what you're speaking of, is one of the hardest things for me. Right?
Yeah.
And that's why it's hard for me to work in an office or different things, because I don't switch back into things as easily. And I, like you, need to silence as many distractions as possible. And so really being able to articulate that to friends that I've had as well, like you did with your husband, and say, this is something where it's not just like, oh, I'm annoyed. It actually is hard for my brain, and it is very difficult for me. And then I don't get as much work done, and then it starts to pile up. Like for me, it definitely is like, I know that sounds dramatic, but that's where it goes. That's where it leads. Yeah. It gets completely derailed. And so really, for me, being able to articulate like that, for you to be able to articulate that and explain to someone, so this is less about your behavior and more about how this behavior feels to me, right? And so I'm asking you if we can shift that behavior so that I don't have to experience all of this. And of course, with him knowing that, of course, if it were an emergency or something he really needed, you of course would be there to respond to him, right? Or he could come up to your office or what have you. But I think that that's also difficult, because it's really vulnerable to tell somebody, hey, this is something that you're doing, and here's what I need instead, or here's what would work for me.
It wasn't even so much, this is what you're doing. I just kind of made it more like, this is what I'm struggling with from everyone, the whole world. Yeah. Like, it wasn't like you're doing this thing. It's like, this is what's happening, and it's really struggling. And so, sorry, but you kind of fall outside that boundary in those moments. And so this is just the way I have to be. It wasn't really even, I tried to make it like less about him bugging me.
Right.
Because it really isn't just him. It's everything.
Right. And
The
if it
whole-
were just him, then that would be a different story, right? But so often
Right.
the times when we are frustrated with things or we're overwhelmed,
Yeah.
it's because it's
Yeah.
a repeated thing across different areas of our life
Yeah.
too, right? And we feel
Yeah.
like, how do I rein this in? Especially, I think, so many people can relate to that because we feel this need to be hyper accessible. We're on all these different channels and all these different ways of getting a hold of us. And like even what you were saying with the Apple Watch, I finally had to take messaging off my Apple Watch because it was the same exact thing, like you were saying. Then
I did. Yeah, I don't get messages
I can't
on my
use it
watch.
for
Yeah.
that. I don't
Yeah.
want it for that because then I just get too distracted. Or really even in some of my email signatures, stating what times I check email. So it's like in my mind,
Oh,
I'm
that's
not
smart.
going,
Yeah.
to the email or telling everybody, okay, I check email at this time, because otherwise I would check and forget, or I'll read something and then forget to reply. So again, knowing that about yourself and being able to state those things, right? And having it not be about the other person, but be about, again, you did that. This is why I need this. This is what happens to me otherwise. And that's why we're doing this in the first place, right?
Right. Yeah. And I didn't really ask him to change his behavior. I just said, this is my boundary. This
Yeah.
is just what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And, I'll respond accordingly. Like
Right.
if it's important, I'll respond, if it's not, then it can wait. How are other ways we can express needs, express boundaries, communicate in a way that's emotionally intelligent and helps foster relationship rather than hurt relationship?
A big piece of it is recognizing those areas where it does feel a little too vulnerable for you to talk to people about. What are some areas where if there's building resentment in any of your relationships, usually that's a sign to like, okay, this must be needed to look at a little bit differently, or maybe there's a boundary here that I can set. And again, so often we are afraid to do those things because we don't want to disrupt the status quo, or we don't want to have that conversation. So really asking yourself, again, how many times am I thinking about this though? How many times am I, and how much energy are you expending thinking
Is
about
this
it?
keeping me up at night?
Right. Instead of having
Right.
the one uncomfortable conversation. Right.
Yeah,
And then I
yeah.
think also with all of this too, really being able to have that conversation while it can feel uncomfortable in the moment, like you said, getting used to kind of being uncomfortable and recognizing the growth that can come from it. And really, when you can negotiate different spaces with your friends or your partners or your family members and really come to a deeper understanding of what each of you needs, then that's a really wonderful thing, right? Because the thing about it is people who love you, for the most part, really actually do want you to be happy, right? So they would rather know how they can contribute to your happiness by maybe a change in the behavior or a change or understanding your response, even if they don't have to change behavior, like you were saying, then they would feel like they're doing something wrong or feeling like, you're avoiding them because you don't like something or what have you, right? So really being able to, I think, to not only state those things to other people, but then also reflect back on how do you receive that when somebody does the same thing to you, right? So a lot of times we will be like, oh, well, they don't respect my boundaries, or this person does this, but then we're the first person to like be like, oh, come on, you don't really want to do that.
Yeah.
So like also
Yeah, it goes both ways.
Yep, it
Yeah.
really does. And having that awareness, or then, okay, so maybe you are going to talk about how something's gone. So then, can you reflect to your loved one, say like, okay, are there areas that I can shift that would make you feel more comfortable? Like, can you have that conversation? And again, like you said, sometimes it's going to be difficult with certain people, or sometimes you really have to weigh out as well, like, okay, how important is this thing to me? Is this something where I see this person every day and it bothers me every day, so I need to address it? Or is this something where, okay, yep, holidays are coming up, I see that person once a year, but it's not worth it for me to have that conversation because I'm going to ignore them that day or whatever, like I can't answer those questions for you either, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think some of this, again, is instead of just being annoyed by all the behaviors or frustrated, ask yourself if what can you do about it, or is there something you want to do about it? So what are those little prickly points for you, or there's annoyances, right? And then also conceptualizing for yourself again, okay, but why does that bother me? Why does it bother me that this person's always late? Is it because I feel disrespected, that they're not, thinking that my time is as valuable? Is it because I think that they forgot about me and then I don't feel important? Like, or is it that I don't think they planned well? Like, really asking yourself, like, why am I annoyed at this, right? And then also, can you kind of correct your responses? Our responses aren't always right. So maybe our go-to response when somebody's late is that they're being disrespectful, instead of our go-to response being like, I'm sure they aren't meaning to hurt my feelings or what have you. They probably just got stopped by a train, or whatever your other storyline could be. So I think some of this too, when we're doing a lot of inner work, it can be easy for us to be like prescribing thoughts and behaviors to other people, instead of really focusing on, okay, but what is that about that situation that impacts my behavior, and how am I showing up afterward, and what behaviors do I need to change as well? Like you said, he didn't have to change his behavior, but he has to know that you're going to stop looking at your phone or whatever.
I'm changing my behavior.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of that becomes about, I don't know how to phrase this. I'm thinking this out loud on the fly. I think a lot of us are trained to get our needs met around, or get what we want out of life around meeting other people's needs.
1,000%.
Right?
Yep.
And so what I've been learning to do is to take care of my needs. And yeah, I have family members. Yeah, I have things, but like, my needs come first. And then, I will figure out how and if and when I can be available for others. So, for example, we currently have 2 people in my very close family diagnosed with cancer at the same, within a week of each other, this fall. And so they're both going to be fine, totally fine, very treatable. It's just a lot of busyness when you deal with a cancer diet. There's just a million appointments and tests and blah. And so one of the people is older, and many other physical ailments came to light during the testing and stuff. So there's just been a bazillion appointments and stuff. And this person doesn't drive. And so all these appointments were getting set. And then I was being told, okay, I need a ride this day, this day, this time, this day. And I'm like, hello. And for a while I went right back into my old, patterns. And I was like, of course. And I'm like rescheduling everything and blocking my day. And it finally has gotten to a point where I'm like, I'm going to give you an Uber gift card. And for some of these appointments, you really don't need me to chauffeur you. You're going to be fine. And then for the ones that are very important, that I know you need a family member sitting with you. Like if it's a blood test, you don't need me.
Right.
If it's meeting with the doctor, I'll be there.
Right.
So, but I felt bad doing it at first. I felt really guilty. I felt like I was letting them down. And then I was like, this is insane. I can't do this forever.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
But it's so hard too, right? Like exactly what you're saying, so often we're setting boundaries with people that we do love and we do care about, and we want to help them because it does feel good to help other people, or we want to make sure that they feel secure in the relationship. So it stems from that good place, right? But then really being able to, especially when people are more and more burnt out now than ever, to look at the ways, okay, is there an area where I can take back a little bit of control? So just like what you did, you didn't let that build to the point where then you got frustrated and then you turn and tell that person, I can never give you a ride again, right? And that's a lot of times what will happen. Then we kind of snap, or we get too overwhelmed, or we just think that whole
or
thing
just do
is
it
the problem.
And resent them for it.
Right, exactly. Instead of being like, okay, how can I shift this a little bit? Exactly what you're saying. How can I still be available on those important days, or the days when they need me to be their ears or need there to be there for them, but not where I'm shuffling everything and going back to having 18-hour days or whatever it is, right?
I would love to pick your brain about conflict. I don't want to end on a negative note. But I think that's something we talked a little bit about, people getting defensive, they're getting their hackles up in certain situations and things kind of going into that conflict mode. And I'm wondering if you have some words of advice. And sort of what we've talked about already kind of de-escalates that, those I statements, that expressing what's happening here rather than there. But I wonder if you have any more to elaborate on handling conflict.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful things is if you can understand other people's conflict styles in addition to your own, and it is everybody's work to do their own work. It's not your job to
Right.
heal somebody else or to analyze somebody else, like I said, but having an understanding of how people do show up in conflict differently. Some people, when we're in a conflict, and also what does that conflict look like if it gets too heated? So say we're in a conflict and it's kind of escalating, and by escalating, it could be like an intensity of emotions. It might be raised voices. It might not. It might just be the subject matter. There's a variety of reasons where we can feel our nervous system ramping up, right? Well, for some people, especially if you have a more anxious attachment style, that conflict for you, you might want to resolve it, or you might feel the need, like you want to get out of it, but yet you want to know what's going to happen, right? If you're in that conflict then with an avoidant person, they might need and feel like they have to just escape that situation, right? Like, I need this conflict to be done. So a lot of times in that dynamic, the more avoidant person will just be like, I don't want to talk about this anymore, or I'm done with this. And they'll want to shut down because they need to go and reset or think about things, right? Well, to a more avoidant person, somebody shutting down the communication completely without them knowing, like, well, when are we going to talk again? What's going to happen? Sends their nervous system even more out of whack, right? And so that's when you might start getting the people who keep coming back to you, like, when can we talk about this? What's wrong? And why are you still mad at me? Because for them, they don't feel more calm because they don't know when you're going to come back to it. So I'm saying all of this because if you know some of those patterns about yourself, or if you can recognize some of those dynamics, then okay, from now on, let's talk about, what does this look like? Hey, when we're in a conflict and you just say that you need to stop talking to me, or that you need a day, or whatever it is, can we establish what that looks like? How long is the time frame before we're going to come back? And can we state that? So then when we go away, I know that we're going to come back to this like later on tonight, or whatever it is, right? And really kind of talking about what that feels like to each person, and understanding that it doesn't feel the same way to everybody, right? And then also within that too, okay, so great, in a conflict, a lot of times, again, make sure you're focusing on the situation, not the person, and not like, oh, okay, now we're in this conflict, so I'm going to like add on every other thing I've
Everything you've ever done to annoy me.
Yeah, let's try to avoid that. That's called gunny sacking. Okay, so let's try to avoid that. And we were piling on everything. So try to keep it about that situation, right? But then another big thing with the conflict resolution piece is it's usually, especially if it's a recurring pattern or behavior or something that you're usually frustrated about, it's not enough to just be like, oh, okay, I forgive you, or I'm not mad anymore. Talking about, again, that behavior change. Okay, what can help the situation? Or what is a different way to approach things? And how can you come about that? And how can you explain that differently to somebody about, again, what are the needs behind this? Why is this bothersome to me? And understanding like, okay, that is bothersome to my partner or my friend. It might not be the thing that bothers me, but it is the thing that bothers them, right? So how can I approach that differently and try to understand their perspective? So it's work though, right? Especially when we're in a conflict and our nervous systems usually are more activated, we tend to get a little less rational, right? We tend to have a little more of emotional reactivity creep in. So also being able to take those pauses or take those breaths, or recognize when the person you're in conflict with isn't, doing that or isn't able to. And I think, again, that bleeds back into all the things that we've talked about, right? Having that awareness of your patterns, understanding what your boundaries are, looking at the ways that other people show up, and then trying to have conversations about, okay, we might do this differently, but how can we do it together in a way that doesn't, destroy both of us or what have you?
Right. And how do you recognize, this may seem really stupid and elemental, but how do you recognize what or the person you're dealing with their conflict style is? Is it is there a basic list of what they are, or is it different for every person?
There is a basic list, and I'd be happy to, I can even send you one that you could put in the show notes or something like that if you'd like. Because from a communication perspective, there are different styles, and there are, of course, different online quizzes and things like that you can take. Sure. But a lot of times it has to be with, sometimes people are accommodating, right? So they get in conflict where they're just going to go along with whatever you say because I need this conflict to be over, or I'm just not going to put myself out there. Then we have people who are avoidant, right? So they're going to do whatever they can to not engage in the conflict or not be part of it. We have people who are more competitive. A lot of times those people, they might want to be right at all costs or might really need to prove why they're right. And so there's a lot of different ways that people, then we also have collaborative people who are really working toward, like, how do we come to this solution, together in a way that neither one of us are really giving up something major, right? And a lot of times those tie in with things, again, like our attachment styles, like the ways we were raised, our upbringing, how we witness conflict, what the responses were to it. So you can't know that by looking at somebody, right? This is where, and a lot of times you can't know to have that conversation either until you've had a conflict where you're like, whoa, that didn't go how I thought it was going to, right?
Or that's a bizarre response. I never would have predicted that.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
And this is why it's like all of these things kind of stack up and add up together. So really being able to recognize that for most people in your adulthood, your conflict style has been embedded in you for so long, right? And so some of those innate reactions can come up even, and then this is where we go afterward and we might shame ourselves, or why did I say that, or we're upset with ourselves, or we come back and apologize. So I think, one thing too is just, you can read about just the different styles to have an understanding of them. But then also, if you're in a long-term relationship with somebody, can you have a conversation like, what did conflict look like for you in your household growing up? And I know that sounds like kind of a weird conversation to have, but at the same time, when you reach adulthood, again, we don't know what we don't know. And so you'd be surprised at the ways, like, somebody doesn't have to tell you all their deepest, darkest secrets about growing up or anything like that.
No.
But people usually do start to have an understanding of how their childhood has shaped them, right? So rather than making assumptions, I would much rather hear it from you. I would much rather you explain that to me so I can hear your perspective of, like, oh, okay, I don't like it when I feel like somebody's raising their voice at me, even if they're not yelling. I instantly start to shut down because that was an experience I had in childhood, so really being able to understand that for myself, really being able to vocalize that to people. Okay, the minute I think you're yelling, even if you don't think you're yelling, right? This is what's going to happen to me. So I think, again, so much of this is, instead of focusing on all the things that everybody's done wrong, trying to understand, okay, what are these patterns? What of them do we want to shift? And how can we do that? How can we do that together? How can we do that on our own? What are the positive steps that we can take? Because it's way too easy otherwise to get focused on these negative things and feel like there's no way out, or there's no hope, or everything is terrible.
Yeah, and if that's what you think, then there's no way to change it. So I feel like full circle, we're coming back around to journaling and, like, noting when these things happen and how you're feeling and how the other person's responding and how you're responding and how you physically feel and all those things. That's when you start to see those patterns.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just so cool that we get the opportunity to keep really, like you said, learning new things and refining the ways that we show up in a way that can help us all have better relationships. So yeah, if anything comes up for anybody, I'd love for people to reach out to me and just let me know if there are other topics or things that they want me to expand upon, because that's what is, my whole purpose behind all of this is I've made it really hard for myself for a really long time. And I think that I'd like it to be a little easier for other people.
Yeah. How can people find you and reach out to you?
You can contact me through my website or find me on LinkedIn or on Instagram or on Facebook at Dr. Cassandra LeClair. And again, like my thing with social media, sometimes it's a little strange for me because I really am like, I don't want to be an influencer. Why do I have to post on social media? So I really had to think about the why behind it. And for me, the why is I do want to help more people. I do want to provide things that I think are helpful and valuable because of my experiences that I've had or my education. So if there are things that, people are interested in knowing more about from a communication perspective, I'd love to just have you DM me, send me a message, and let me know so I can make some things that are valuable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll make sure to put links to your website and your socials on our website. So everyone
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. It's been really a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed meeting you, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds good.
That's a Hard No is a production of Clever Girl Marketing, my little agency in Cleveland, in partnership with our friends at Evergreen Podcasts. Many thanks to our amazing team, including Maura Del Rosario, our production and marketing coordinator, Noah Fouts, our amazing producer, editor, and composer who wrote our theme music and performed it with his band, The Big Leagues, and our new video producer and editor, Kay Holmberg. You can find show notes and resources on our website, and you can find other fun stuff on our socials. We're Hard No Podcast. Find your no, then say it with me.